Okay, today I am with two experts I'm really excited to talk with and to pick their brains on the subject of the relationship between mental health and entrepreneurship. By way of intro, Dr. Michael Freeman is a psychiatrist, a serial entrepreneurship researcher, and behavioral health systems architect. Dr. Freeman serves as a clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, and as a mentor in the Entrepreneurship Center at UCSF. With support from the Kauffman Foundation, Dr. Freeman also studies issues related to entrepreneur mental health in collaboration with colleagues from other universities and from the Gallup Organization. And additionally, he was the founding chief medical officer at US Behavioral Health and the founder of Econa, which is the Global Center of Excellence for Entrepreneur Mental Wellness. And that's actually how Dr. Freeman and I first connected. I also want to introduce Dr. Adrienne Heinz. She's a licensed psychologist who conducts research and clinical practice in the areas of resilience, trauma, anxiety, and substance abuse. I'm very familiar with a couple of those myself. She received her bachelor's in psychology and cognitive science from UNC Chapel Hill, doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and completed a postdoc fellowship at Stanford University. Dr. Heinz is also a research scientist for the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs at the VA National Center for PTSD and Stanford University School of Medicine, where she specializes in developing, evaluating, and implementing digital health solutions. She, last but not least, also works as a consultant advising entrepreneurs on well-being and mental health strategy in the workplace. So yeah, I'm with two folks who really know what they're talking about, all things trauma-related and entrepreneurship-related. So I'm happy to have both of you, and thanks for carving out the time.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Dr. Freeman, maybe we can start with a question for you. You've previously described mental health differences in entrepreneurship are two sides of the same coin. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean as these are two sides of the same coin?
I would be happy to. What I mean, simply stated, is that prosperity through entrepreneurship is not possible without driving it through people that have mental health conditions. The people with mental health conditions are the people who start and grow companies. Not 100%, there's a lot. So in one of those studies that you just referenced that we did with the Kauffman Foundation, we found that about 38% of entrepreneurs have diagnosable mental health conditions. Not only that, but some of the people who the mental health world would consider to be the most severely affected by mental health conditions actually get the best business results. And there's another side of that coin as well. But what about the 62% of entrepreneurs that don't have mental health conditions? We looked at their families, and what we found is that at least half of the people, the asymptomatic entrepreneurs is what we call them, at least half of them came from families where there was quite a significant incidence of diagnosable mental health conditions. And so what we ended up concluding was that that set of entrepreneurs were the ambassadors of the positive traits, and whereas other people in their family had more of the disability. So the thing to know is that every mental health difference is associated with strengths and vulnerabilities. And that if you're the entrepreneur, what's important is just to be aware of who you are. And when I work with people, I call it a user's guide to your mind, how your mind works, and figure out what are the superpowers that go with this and learn how to play those cards as much as you can and how to manage the risk associated with the rest of it.
Yeah, and that's an important point because I can recall from my personal experience the first time that I received diagnoses of complex PTSD and obsessive compulsive disorder, it was beneficial to receive those labels because at least I could say, this is a thing that I can now put my finger on and other people are experiencing it. But there was also the downside that it felt highly stigmatized because at least the conversation at the time didn't involve the topic of the two sides of the sword, so to speak. I didn't talk about the positive traits. I later on figured that out myself, and I'm glad that I did, but that's not a point that I hear raised too often. And just to dive into that a little bit more, can you say more specifically about, is it that there were prior life experiences or genetic preconditions that have then endowed somebody with those characteristics that lend themselves well to entrepreneurship? Is it something else entirely?
It's all of the above plus one more. Many people, and you've talked about your own experience, are affected by childhood experiences, family of origin experiences, life experiences. That's not only true for people who grow up in underprivileged financial circumstances or in homes with violence or drug and alcohol problems or emotional or physical abuse. It's also true for immigrants. It's also true for people who live through a tsunami or a famine or something like that. A lot of things can happen to you that affect what you bring to the party. The genetic part is also true, that many of the people with those conditions we looked into have a family genetic history of more of the same among other family members. And then, so that's what you bring to the party, but it's also the case that the party brings something to you. And if you're an entrepreneur and you go through a down round, or your board has a fight, or you run out of runway and you go into bankruptcy, that can cause mental health issues too. So people bring mental health stuff into entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurship causes mental health challenges at the same time.
So it's some amount of nature, it's some amount of nurture,
and it's some amount of shit happens.
It's a cocktail.
Which in the world of entrepreneurship, whether you're the founder of the company or one of the early employees or investors, you just know that shit hits the fan all the time. So there's no shortage of opportunities for the situation of an entrepreneur to provoke those things in us.
Yeah, so a good example of that is the roller coaster ride. Everybody's familiar with that famous cartoon of we're killing it, oh my God, we're going to crash and burn. And so the positive and the negative signals come to you through starting and building a business. But entrepreneurs overreact to positive and negative signals because of how they're hardwired. So it's what you bring to the party and what the party brings to you.
And so when you say overreact, you mean interpret negative situations. I see. So something that's slightly negative in their mind is profoundly negative, and something slightly positive is strongly positive.
Yeah, I got an interview. I'm pitching to a name brand VC firm in your mind turns into, and then after that we can go public.
Or if the pitch doesn't go well, then in your mind is I've failed at life and I might as well.
Everybody in the valley is going to find out about this and I'll never get another shot.
I see. That's interesting. So it's not only a combination of this double-sided nature of one's attributes or characteristics, but also the tendency towards, I guess you would call it, more volatile reactionaryism or more dramatic.
It's called reward sensitivity. That's the technical name for it.
From a dopamine standpoint?
Yeah.
I see. Reward sensitivity. That's a fantastic euphemism. I like that quite a bit. To build off of that a little bit, I have a question for you, Dr. Heinz. One thing that I've learned and experienced based on my own PTSD diagnosis is that the symptoms of overwork or professional burnout could look and feel very similar to me to the symptoms that I would experience at times with my post-traumatic response. And it got me thinking quite a bit about I was like, what is the commonality here between I'm working really hard and I'm completely burnt out versus something that triggered my post-traumatic response? So I guess the question to you is, what insights from your research on PTSD can be applied to the stresses of entrepreneurship? Like, how are the two similar or different?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, right? Sometimes it's hard to distinguish. Is this me being triggered because it brings up me not being protected in childhood? Or is it because I haven't slept in a couple days and my reserves are low and I don't have the emotional bandwidth to take a deep breath and come back to this in a moment? So that looking at the etiology or the source of what's causing it is challenging. And sometimes it's really hard to distinguish when you're in go mode or depleted in every way with your business. It almost doesn't matter. It goes back to, what do I do to take care of myself and honor my needs? With trauma, there's often a response to hustle harder, work harder, stay busy. It's not okay to rest. You know how to fight, but teaching yourself to rest is much harder.
Yeah, that's something that now that I'm 40 years old, I can say that the idea of self-care first made its way into my life at the age of 38. That was after many periods of burnout and what have you, where then I finally learned that lesson the hard way is, oh, that's right. I can't always just be pushing at 100. I have to take care of myself at times. And then to build on that a little bit more and thinking of it within the framework of entrepreneurship, it sounds like one of the key things that soon-to-be entrepreneur needs to do is first somewhat take an inventory of who they are and understand, hey, before I launch into this, here are my sort of tendencies, my strengths and weaknesses, and the ways in which this could go wrong in a sense. But it sounds like another part of it is, okay, I also need to create a program around self-care to keep myself within a certain set of guardrails. That's what I've taken from it so far. But when either of you, as an entrepreneur yourself or in talking with entrepreneurs, like, what other sort of preparatory work can an entrepreneur do to prepare themselves for the difficult journey of starting a business and be able to survive it psychologically and physically?
I don't know if there's anything that could technically prepare you for the chaos that you embark upon, but I think there's forms of radical acceptance of checking your expectations for yourself, other people in the world, and what's going to happen on the journey. If you, like Dr. Freeman was saying, a lot of these mental health differences can be strengths and even superpowers, but some people are afraid to really go in there and look at, how is this showing up for me in my day-to-day? Does it impair my functioning, my relationships? Am I bringing my garbage to work and putting that on my team? So a lot of that, the inventory approach is helpful, because if you can learn how to harness it and then pull the levers on what you have to offer, even if it's a mental health difference, you can go much further than if you have your head in the sand like an ostrich and ignore how those differences might be impacting you or those around you.
I think on top of that, I agree with Dr. Heinz. It's very difficult to wrap your head around this at the beginning of the journey. A lot of one interesting factoid is that the age of onset of entrepreneurship and the age of onset of virtually all mental health conditions is the same, which is
it
late
sort of
adolescence, early adulthood.
Interesting.
And some people believe that entrepreneurship is a symptom of the early expression of some kind of mental health condition. But when you're in that mode and you're going to go out and conquer the world, it's hard to think ahead and come up with the idea that maybe you should have a spare tire in the trunk.
Yeah, especially in
to the
Silicon
extent
Valley
that anybody
businesses.
wants to think ahead, I think a few simple things would just be basic wellness, meaning make sure you get enough sleep every day. Make sure that you have keep yourself physically tuned up, as in good nutrition. Make sure that you have strong relationships with friends and loved ones. And make sure that there's some part of your life where you don't need to be validated as a person based on what you achieve. That you're like, it's okay to be you, even if you don't knock it out of the park. So a few little things like that, I think, can go a long way. If you want to add on top of that, learning some basic coping skills, like Dr. Heinz just said, radical acceptance. It's a coping skill, and maybe a few more of those would go a long way.
Yeah, I especially like the radical acceptance. As a quick anecdote, this was while I was at Wealthfront, which is a consumer finance startup. Very difficult to try and build a new financial institution within a highly regulated industry. So needless to say, it was a stressful startup journey, but there were many times throughout the journey where some of the younger folks at the company would be freaking out over something, and I would just sit there and giggle about it. And they were like, why is this not stressing you out? And I said, it was like, look, this is my fourth startup, and all four of them have had just disasters all the time. And so it's this Buddhist approach to saying, everything is in constant change and I can't resist it. Like, I'm just going to accept the suffering of this and just laugh about it. What else can you do? So
Yeah.
I think that's a powerful trait to cultivate in oneself.
That it is what it is. And I want to add one more piece to what Dr. Freeman said about not getting your identity and your worth and value enmeshed with the success of your business, is really teaching what self-compassion is. I think many people conflate it with self-pity or making excuses, when in fact self-compassion is a practice to accept yourself where you are as an imperfect and flawed human being in a shared humanity. And without that, it's a tortured journey.
Absolutely.
Self-compassion is absolutely mission critical.
Absolutely. And it's especially prevalent within startup community, because you just have a ton of, I was one of them, of high achievers who have never failed at anything really. And not only have they never really failed, they've always been at the top of the heap in whatever they did. And speaking for myself, my identity was entirely informed by my successes and my failures. If I succeeded, then great. Just the ego of Andy continued to grow. And that was the thing that fueled me. And if I failed, then I didn't just fail at that task. I failed at everything. And it was something that took me a very long time to learn, was what you pointed out, which was what you work on is not who you are. And consequently, the results of what you work on does not determine your value as a human being. But learning to unwind that as a high achiever it's difficult. It takes a lot of time and usually some rough lessons. At least that's been my experience with it. But that's a critical point. I think if for the entrepreneurs that are going to listen to this, one piece of advice that I would give that's related to that is to really deeply think through and give yourself time before you choose the final product that you're going to work on as your startup. Because one of the slippery slopes for a high achiever is to pick a startup idea based on its potential or because it's in a hot industry, which is entirely different than picking a startup idea based on your natural, intuitive interests and desires and capabilities, or solving a problem that you're personally passionate about. Because the risk is if you basically work on something because you think it'll succeed, that's usually not enough for you to maintain that level of effort throughout. And it runs the huge risk that then you're very susceptible to associating your individual self-worth with the success or outcome of what you work on. So yeah, pick the idea wisely. It's to where, like, even if you fail at it, because you worked on something that is just who you are and what you wanted to do, it was still time well spent. I guess that's the TLDR of it.
I would agree with that. And I would add one more thing, which is to pick something where you have domain expertise. And I say that because I've worked with a number of entrepreneurs. This is either as a psychiatrist or as an executive coach, who start businesses that are related to their own personal lived experience, where they have a sense of personal motivation and investment in whatever they're trying to accomplish. But it turns out that's not enough to actually get liftoff with a new business because they may be lacking in some of the technical expertise that's required to do what they are setting out to do. I've seen that problem happen quite a bit. So another dimension of this radical acceptance concept that applies to, Andy, what you're talking about is whatever is the opposite of hubris. It's have a sense of humility and accept the idea that you don't know what you don't know. Entrepreneurs, when you meet with them, they can project a sense of exaggerated pride or hubris or elevated self-confidence, and that can get in the way at times too.
Yeah, it's and all things map back to make sure you understand yourself. At least some.
Do the work so you don't bring it to work.
I like that. Yeah, that's very true for an entrepreneur too. It's tough when you are working with one who doesn't even understand their own tendencies. Been there before, don't want to do it again. One question for you, Dr. Heinz. In a previous interview I was reading of yours, you mentioned that, quote, recovery from trauma requires multiple channels, end quote. Can you say more about that?
I can say so much, but I'll start with saying, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet cure for trauma, especially complex trauma. There's this popularization of psychedelics that have a place in a growing evidence space. Taking psilocybin or MDMA is going to cure me of these troubles. And in reality, working through your trauma involves so many pieces. We store trauma in our bodies somatically, so movement is really important. Also, the most powerful form of healing is in community and in relationships. Our relationships get us through the most awful times. And often with trauma, we go inwards and our world gets smaller and we start to avoid the people, places, and things that remind us of what happened. And that's the opposite of the medicine that we need. Mm. And in addition to movement, community is having someone to walk through it with you, hand in hand. It's ripping off a Band-Aid. It's really painful. It's uncomfortable. It's like going to the gym. But once you walk through your narrative and then integrate how the worst parts of your life fit into a new story, you're no longer held back by what happened to you. It doesn't define you anymore. And that's really important too.
And that's consistent with my personal experience. I've experienced significant healing and moments of transformation, once through very deep focused meditation, once through, or I should say a couple of times through EMDR, which I was very responsive to, some through psychedelics, and others through long stretches alone in nature. And you never know where you're going to find the ability to heal. And sometimes it just requires that the Captain Ahab type tendency to go after the white whale, so to speak, and until you've found that solution. And one of the reasons I wanted to ask that question is as backdrop for this next question, which is I've spoken with a lot of entrepreneurs and high achievers, and they know that there is something more underneath the hood, so to speak, and that there is psychological pain and emotional pain of one form or another that's just below the surface. And when they start talking about it, I also observe that they then pull back from it, find ways to maybe minimize it or avoid it because it's uncomfortable, understandably, but also because some of them feel that they intuitively understand that there's a connection between their achievement orientation, their professional success, monetary success, and some of that old trauma. And so what they've sometimes directly expressed to me is, I'm actually afraid to turn inward and do this work because I'm worried that I'm going to no longer be successful in the external world if I do. Both of you are nodding your heads, so I'm guessing that you've encountered this before, but I'll leave it open for both of you, but I would love to hear your perspective on interacting with high achievers like that are afraid to do the work because they believe that they will no longer be as successful if they do?
So my team did a literature search on adverse childhood experiences and trauma and entrepreneurship. And what we found out is that there is actually a rather substantial research literature about how trauma and how adverse childhood experiences contribute to being a better entrepreneur. This is what you just said. And some of the studies found that difficult childhoods lead to increased self-reliance, better coping skills, being more comfortable with taking risks, better ability to tolerate the uncertainties of self-employment, higher level of initiative, greater independence.
I'm kind of laughing because it sounds like if I had an online dating profile, this would be my.
Yeah. And I can go on and on. And these studies were done not just in the United States, but in Asia as well. Part one is that something about all of this negative experience did have a positive outcome. In fact, there's this one researcher who calls it the theory of underdog entrepreneurs. And he said that underdogs become entrepreneurs out of both necessity and choice, and that their early disadvantages are predictors of later success and greater propensity for entrepreneurship. There are plenty of examples of that. That's the baby that everybody's afraid of throwing out with the bathwater. And the question you raise is, what happens if you drain the bathwater? Is the baby still there? And I think the answer to that is yes. And people have to be reassured that by the time you're even old enough to be asking the question that you just asked, that those characteristics are so deeply ingrained, they're not going to go away.
Yeah, they don't just disappear after a good dose of mushrooms or something like that.
Yeah.
They do not. And Andy, I know you mentioned it was like laughter of recognition, and my nodding and smiles come from personal recognition too, of this issue of if you throw out the bathwater, what will be left? Someone not wanting to look under the hood and go deeper for fear of what might happen. And this is where my personal and professional life have collided. My little brother, Austin Heinz, was an entrepreneur. He was in Korea developing a laser for graduate school, came to take it to market in San Francisco, moved onto my couch, raised over $10 million, hired 20 employees, opened a giant laboratory in Soma in San Francisco, and harnessed a lot of those mental health differences to help him get there. He didn't have a safety net. He didn't really have much room for error. And so if he were to go inwards, a lot of the thought process would be, what if that destabilizes me so much I can't do my job? What if that gets me in a stuck place where I'm no longer able to keep things going with my team? And as a psychologist, trying to help someone through that, especially a loved one and a family member, was devastating. And ultimately, my brother lost his life to suicide. And I think, obviously, we can do these analyses of what if we did something different. Trust me, I've thought about it 50 different ways. But not going there is often what makes us sicker. And maybe had he accepted treatment, it would have gone in a different direction.
Yeah. Yeah. And first, thank you for sharing that. I think any of us can list a handful of people just off the top of our head of wonderful people who were innovative and creative and high energy, and they were builders and people that we looked up to, but we also lost. And I agree with you, Dr. Heinz, that at the end of the day, and I share a similar message of, hey, the baby's still going to be there. Your abilities are still going to be there. The thing that changes is the why behind what you're doing and where you point those superpowers. And what I've personally experienced is that I eventually got to a point where I said, okay, yep, I am wired in this way. And my goal is not to try and take an ice cream scooper and dig those parts out of my brain and act as if they were never a part of me, but to instead use the language of integration and say, let me point these, let me sharpen my spear. And instead of pointing these abilities towards the desire to achieve and make money and earn status, which is what I was really driven by in the past, it switched to, okay, let me point these superpowers in the direction of helping people. And it's not that I want to ignore that I have these tendencies to obsess over things and be a perfectionist and think in grandiose terms, but now I'm going to do it for a cause that makes me feel like a purpose in life that is helping others. Like that's the message I try and share with folks is do the work, turn inward, don't delay the pain. It only gets worse. And the parts of you that you love in yourself will not go away. They will be accentuated in ways you can only imagine, and that will be largely positive for you moving forward.
That's beautiful. You really go from surviving to living and meaning making, two very different things.
Just to build on that a little bit in our research, we did a really nice study of 1,000 entrepreneurs. This is with the Gallup Organization. We were able to use their database, and so it was what they call a national probability sample. In other words, really representative sample of entrepreneurs of all different kinds, all different locations. And we found in that group that 3% of them had made suicide attempts, which is a big number. And so you think about people like Adrienne's brother or other people that you read about in the paper, or people that you may have known personally, but what you want to also know is that this is pretty pervasive. We found that 1.7% of entrepreneurs had a history of psychiatric hospitalization. That's also a big number.
Yeah,
then,
that's very high.
As I said, the 38% is a big number too, of people who right off the bat are happy to tell you about their mental health symptoms. So one of my concerns about that has been that there really is no safety net for entrepreneur mental health. And that's, you talk, Andy, about having a sense of purpose. That's my sense of purpose. Why is that? If you think about health insurance and health care, mental health care, you realize that people who have jobs, employed people, have mental health benefits and have mental health services because of employer-sponsored health care. And if you think about people who are seriously mentally ill, or people who have disabilities, or people who are unemployed, they have access to health and mental health benefits and services because of government-funded Medicaid, unemployment insurance, COBRA, that kind of stuff. But self-employed people do not have mental health benefits and do not have mental health services. There is literally no safety net. So for me, and Dr. Heinz has been helping me with this for many years now, part of what I think the ecosystem needs to do is start weaving together that safety net.
Yeah, and that I know of several entrepreneurs that during the early days of starting their business, although they might have incorporated the company in Delaware, they were in another country because, if anything, they said, not only do I need to keep my costs low while I'm building this, but if something happens with my health, at least here I know I can walk into the doctor and pay a fraction of what I would pay back home because I can't cover any of this. Do you think that there are plans in place, or is there a path forward to creating that sort of safety net? I'm unaware of other countries or industries doing something similar, so I'm naive on the subject. But
yes, there is a path forward. If somebody would care to invest in it, it could be done. For example, one of the risk factors, one of the mental health risk factors for entrepreneurs is precarity. That means being in a precarious situation. Well, a lot of entrepreneurs end up living at or below the poverty level. In other countries, that does not prevent you from having access to all kinds of support services that reduce your stress enough so you can work on starting your next business. Another thing related to that is unemployment. When people who have jobs go through a reduction in force or get laid off or something, they have unemployment insurance that reduces their stress and precarity. But when entrepreneurs create jobs, and when you are building a company, you're paying unemployment insurance so that all of your employees have a safety net. But when the company fails and you go bankrupt, you don't have the safety net. So what they did in France, which I thought was very interesting, was that they created unemployment insurance for entrepreneurs, unemployment insurance for self-employed people. And sure enough, those people bounced back faster and they started new companies, and the new companies did well and they created more jobs. So things like that can be done, and they have been done in other places.
A lot of barriers to care. Even when people have opportunities to bounce back through these financial safety nets, people with insurance have an impossible time finding a provider with an opening, and then finding one that's affordable. And then if you're an entrepreneur, finding one that's culturally competent. Is your provider going to understand your lived experience? Unless they've had some training or consultation, they're not going to understand that, like, your lifestyle looks really different than someone who works at a corporation. So there's a lot of things that can be done. There's systemic barriers we can tackle, and then obviously organizational conversations like this help shed light on it. But hopefully with the pandemic having spotlighted the importance of mental health, we're going to start to see some movement and relief in the suffering of Americans and beyond. But I do think digital technologies like mobile apps and digital therapeutics can help with the scalability issue. But yeah, it can be discouraging at times.
And then one of the other barriers is shame and stigma. People are just afraid to reach out. So that's why I think that this podcast that you've been working on, for example, and other ways of introducing and normalizing these mental health issues among entrepreneurs can be really positive and foundational to making it safe for people to express what their needs are and reach out for help.
The stigma is still substantial, not only amongst the community of entrepreneurs, but amongst the community of investors that have been around. One of the common things that I'd hear from some investors is, oh, the really strong entrepreneurs, they'll make it through, and they didn't need extra support in order to build a multi-billion-dollar business. And it's just such cherry picking of the anecdotes and of the evidence. It can be further from the truth.
And speaking of those entrepreneurs, of those investors, they know that over 50% of the companies in their portfolios, if you're a venture capitalist, you invest in 100 companies, you know that 50 or 60 are going to fail and 20 or 30 are going to get stuck in the mud. Why is that acceptable, and to what extent are those companies that failed reflecting an outcome that's related to the founder being depressed?
Depression is the global leading cause of disability. People think it's diabetes or heart disease. What if you helped those founders with their mental health? Think about what your portfolio would do.
Yeah, and I try and express it in a few ways. One of them is just a shift in perspective, where I'd say, what if we thought of entrepreneurs as athletes, where beginning at the college level and then especially into the professional ranks, when you're an athlete, it's well known, it's not stigmatized whatsoever, that you surround that athlete with a whole team of experts, from nutritionists to strength and conditioning coaches to rehabilitation, ice baths, soft tissue work, chiropractic work, active release, you name it, because they understand that, one, what the athlete is trying to do is extremely difficult and takes a huge burden on their physical and mental health. Two, that's not a bad thing. They're putting themselves under excess stress that requires the body to be broken down and recuperate at times in order to get stronger. And then three, it's consistent with the outcomes of the athletic directors and the coaches and what have you, is to invest in the athlete, because they're more likely to be successful. And as a result, the rising tide lifts all boats. And it's hard for me to poke holes in a similar comparison to that of being an entrepreneur. And so let's not act as if they aren't going to be put under extreme pressure and face psychological challenges along the way. It almost requires that's going to be the case. So let's staff as many entrepreneurs as we can with a supportive team that helps them be healthy and successful, because everyone gets to celebrate if they do. Oh, but so far I haven't convinced too many.
But you're preaching to the converted here.
Yeah. And if any venture capitalists are listening to this, I guess I'll speak in your language, which is just think about it in terms of asymmetric upside. If, let's say, the typical startup, it's 4 to 5 employees, it's a seed round or a pre-seed round of 1 to 3 million. The typical operating costs for that company could be anywhere between $50,000 to $100,000 a month once you factor in real estate and salaries and everything, right? So let's say 50 to 100K. But if it only costs another $2,000 to $4,000 a month to then provide a team of professionals and therapists and or coaches behind those athlete entrepreneurs, that cost of another $2,000 to $4,000 a month relative to the 50 to 100,000 a month baseline operating expense is minor. But if you can help those entrepreneurs withstand this difficult experience and come out even more and capable, and they build a successful company, I mean, for that relatively low cost, there's huge potential upside. And that's why, so I'm using the venture capital language of asymmetric upside, is like, it's there. Their job is to invest where they believe there is asymmetric upside. So somehow, some way, one of my personal goals would be that for future financings, that there is always some earmark that is made for professional health services to support these entrepreneurs. It's not exclusionary because of cost, I can tell you that. So, anyhow.
And to take that one step farther, again, for all the investors who are listening to the podcast, one way to do that is write in a provision in your Series A agreement or in your seed round agreement where 1% or 2% of whatever the investment is earmarked off the top for development.
Yeah, and the asymmetric upside becomes even more favorable in later rounds because, to your point, let's say it's a Series A. The typical Series A prior to at least the current fallout in the industry was, on average, almost $15 million. But even if you cut that in half and you say that the new Series A is going to be a typical sort of $6 million, $7 million round, again, another $2,000 to $4,000 a month to provide professional support to your founders. It's a rounding error, and it becomes increasingly small as the check sizes get bigger. Anyhow, I'm glad that
to a nothing burger.
Yeah, exactly. Or as, pardon my French, but I heard one of my favorite entrepreneurs, he always said, it's mouse nuts. It's too small for anyone to carry about. It's mouse nuts. We should do this. And I was like, okay, I'm going to steal that term. And I don't know when I'll be able to use it, but I finally found a use case for it.
That's going to be a great tattoo for someone.
All right. Dr. Freeman, question for you. I was listening to one of your prior interviews, and you referenced a book called The Deviant's Advantage. Does that ring a bell?
It rings a bell. I'm seeing if I can find it on my bookshelf. But yeah, I read that when it came out. It was really interesting. I can't find it right away. But the basic concept is that entrepreneurs are rebels. And their rebel attitude often gets expressed early in life. In fact, many entrepreneurs have a history of interaction with the criminal justice system, like in adolescence. You may be aware of Bill Gates getting for stealing a car or something.
Yeah, his mugshot. His
mugshot, yeah. And that rebel attitude can morph into creating rebel products. And what I refer back to often is that if a lot of entrepreneurs have this experience where they got bounced out of class in grade school and middle school and high school because of being disruptive. But then fast forward 5 years. And now being disruptive is a good thing and everybody wants to invest in them. It's the same person. It's the same like rebel person. And sometimes it works for you and sometimes it works against you. A lot of those rebel ideas turn into rebel products that become rebel brands, and they attract huge followings. And that's the concept of the deviance advantage.
I see. So for either of you, when you're speaking with entrepreneurs, is that if there was a short list of resources, books, lectures that you point folks towards, is that one of them? And if so, what are the other resources that you think ideal for entrepreneurs to consume?
To the extent that people are interested, there is a growing literature where entrepreneurs write about their own experience. Like Andy Dunn, who was the founder of Bonobos, he wrote a book recently called Burn Rate, where he talks about having a manic episode as part of his experience of building and growing his company. And there are other books of that nature. There's one called The Hypomanic Edge by a guy named John Gartner, which is a historical overview of bipolar spectrum conditions among entrepreneurs going all the way back to the early days of America. So, for example, Andrew Carnegie is one of the biographies in there. He was the wealthiest person in the world at the time, and he had a lot of big mental health problems. So I've gotten a lot from reading these biographies. I'm just looking at my bookshelf here. There's one called Killing It by Cheryl O'Loughlin. There's one called Happy at Any Cost about Tony Hsieh. So that literature, I think, has been helpful. And it normalizes these differences.
Storytelling is really powerful. Absolutely. And I think what I'm learning in my clinical work is one of the biggest resources that entrepreneurs have is each other. But it's hard to connect in that authentic, disarming way because of the persona we need to present. I run a peer support group for entrepreneurs, and it's incredible the way that they show up for each other, because it's not having to explain yourself. You're understood the moment you walk in the door. And you didn't thrive necessarily in a traditional setting, like an educational institution. But here you are forging an untraditional path that's really exciting, but also really hard. And there's other people that can see you and know you in that way. And it's not only is it comforting, it's validating. And when entrepreneurs are able to open up to each other in that authentic way, you can do a lot with that. Our relationships are like the fabric of who we are and how we get through hard times. So coming together, you don't need a lot of friends, but a few close ones really make a big difference.
Yeah, there's no pill that can replace bonding with another person.
To that point, another book I would put on the book list is this book called Startup Life by Brad Feld and Amy Batchelor. It's a sleeper. It's been out for a long time now, but Brad Feld was an entrepreneur who became an investor, and he and his wife wrote a book about how to have a kind of happy, healthy marriage while being an entrepreneur. And they tell their own story, but they also have a lot of good tips, and they bring in other couples in the process. So I found that to be a very, very useful resource, because this work-family balance issue is always a challenge for entrepreneurs.
Okay, yeah, and I'll be sure to add for the show notes, I'll type up after this. I'll make sure to provide a link to each of those books that was mentioned. And Dr. Heinz, if you mentioned that you run a support group or a peer group for entrepreneurs, do you have, for the entrepreneurs that might listen to this, do you have other thoughts or recommendations around how they can find similar groups to the one that you're running?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. It's a peer support group, so I don't use my license as a psychologist, and it's really remarkable to see the group govern itself and show up for each other. It's not just me asking questions, people raising their hands. So this could be created just like a 12-step program, honestly, like self-facilitated. And these group members make a commitment to each other to show up once a week, once a month, and to talk real. You can literally raise your hand when the answer is boring and surfacey and ask someone to go further. I think having permission to do that from your peers can take you to a place where you won't necessarily get with a therapist or a coach or a spouse or your coworkers. It's a unique angle you can offer each other. So there's that. And then obviously there's incubators. Dr. Freeman can speak more to those resources.
One resource that I often refer people to are entrepreneurship networks like Startup Grind or YPO or Endeavor or Vistage or Entrepreneurs Organization. There are a bunch of them out there, and they all get you to join some kind of a forum, and the forums all have about 7, 8, 9 people in them. And they typically have some training for the forum leaders. And even though it's not particularly designed to be a mental health group, the groups become quite supportive. People get to know each other very well, and they help each other out with business, but also with life issues. I think being part of an entrepreneur network is a good mental health safety net idea for a lot of people. And if you get into the network and go a little deeper and join one of the forums, that can be quite supportive as well.
Yeah, and
but you get in what you put it. You get out what you put in that. If you don't show up with vulnerability and you talk about how you're crushing it and things are great, it's not going to be a useful exercise.
Yeah, I second that. And it's what I'll usually recommend to entrepreneurs is I say, if you can't find the group that you want, like, you can create it. It's easy enough because you have at least a handful of other entrepreneurs that you know somewhat closely that you can invite to it. And then with the combination of Zoom and your own Discord server where you can chat privately, create the one that you're looking for. But in addition to that, I recommend that, similar to what you mentioned, Dr. Heinz, is when you set up that meeting, it may even be helpful for you to attend one of the 12-step meetings. Just go to Codependence Anonymous or any of the groups and see what it's like for people to be completely open and deeply vulnerable in a way like you have never seen. And then on the other side of that, to receive nothing but focus and support and care. And see and experience what it's like to be that vulnerable and to be completely accepted at the same time. And it'll transform you. And you can take the method or the framework of a 12 steps meeting and apply it directly or fairly loosely to your own. And it'll blow your mind how good it feels and how much healing can come from the catharsis that's experienced by just being vulnerable and saying everything that you've been afraid to say up to this point.
And I'll add to that, it's that the role of the listener is not to problem solve. A lot of entrepreneurs love to do that. Yeah. But when you listen with an open heart to understand versus to respond, that's transformational too.
Okay, so I've had you for about an hour now, and I want to be respectful of time. And just one final, somewhat open-ended question before we wrap things up, which is just for the entrepreneurs and the investors who may be listening to this. If there was a message that you would like to leave them with, what would that message be?
I would say the world needs you. Entrepreneurs create 80% of net new jobs. Economies in all kinds of countries cannot survive without entrepreneurs. So by pursuing your passion, you're also doing something really important for your community. And with that in mind, don't feel like you need to be hugely successful in whatever this endeavor is that you're pursuing in order to be a worthwhile person, that you don't need your business to validate you. You're already valid. And that the point of the exercise, yes, you want to be profitable. Yes, you want to introduce awesome products and services. But the point of the exercise also is about happiness, and that you want to keep some kind of a metric for happiness on your dashboard as well as everything else.
Yeah, I think Paul Graham of YC, I read somewhere that somebody asked him, what's the job of the CEO? And he listed a few things, but one of them he said was to be happy. And it surprised people, but it makes tons of sense. It's like, what you're doing is difficult. It's going to require years, if not decades. If you can't find a way to enjoy what you're doing, you're not going to stick it out. You're not going to want to. It's not going to be a good experience. What about you, Dr. Heinz? Sorry, I know don't want to put you on the spot too much.
Yeah, those are hard to follow, but I would really just keep adding to that and saying your business is only as healthy as you are. You are worthy of rest and peace when you can have it. And you are the emotional barometer for your team. And so by taking care of yourself, you set a culture that honors the needs of us as humans. We're not meant to work all the time. Just the hustle culture trope. It's seductive, but it's not sustainable. And just recognizing that if you're not well and you don't have your health, you have very little.
Yeah. I think it's a perfect way to bring this discussion to a close. And I just want to thank both of you again for the work that you're doing in helping other people, and for sharing your wisdom with me so that I could share it with my audience. So thank you again, and I appreciate it.
Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Yeah, rock on.
Thanks.